A low grey dawn seeped through the thin horizontal windows above the walls of Riverbend Correctional Facility in rural Georgia, the kind of morning where even the sky seemed unwilling to witness what the day had planned. Inside, the air felt heavy, unmoved, like it had accepted years ago that nothing good happened here anymore. And deep within the maximum security wing, 38-year-old Jeremy Knox sat shackled to a metal-framed bed, a paper-thin blanket folded neatly beside him, untouched for days now because sleep had become an enemy, a temptation he couldn't afford in the final hours of his life. Today, at 9:01 a.m., he was scheduled to die by lethal injection for a crime he'd never confessed to, a murder he insisted for 5 years he didn't commit, and though the world had long stopped listening, Jeremy clung to a final request like it was a lifeline. To sanity, he wanted to see Max, his dog, one last time. Max wasn't just a pet, he was the one living creature who had known Jeremy before all this, back when his life was a simple mosaic of morning runs, security night shifts, and lazy weekend. BBQs with his fiancée Clara Santiago in the suburbs outside Augusta, back before the media storm, before the courtroom betrayals, before he was known not as a veteran or volunteer dog trainer, but as the Warehouse Killer, a name that filled tabloids and cable news with equal parts fury and certainty. Yet, Jeremy had maintained his innocence every single day since the arrest, his pleas ignored, appeals denied, even as the evidence used against him raised questions that no one seemed willing to ask out loud anymore. Now the prison halls hummed with rehearsed routine, guards rotating their shifts, nurses prepping the small sterile chamber where the injection would happen, and somewhere, possibly in a cramped office with a flickering fluorescent light, Warden Rachel Dunley reviewed his request with the Department of Corrections, aware that this wasn't standard procedure and likely wouldn't be granted, but something about Jeremy's file had always troubled her. Something in his eyes when he spoke, and the way he never begged or manipulated like the others did, only asked calmly, "Please, ma'am, let me see Max before I go," and then turned his gaze toward the tiny window like he was trying to remember the color of the sky. Rachel had denied hundreds of last-minute appeals and whimsical wishes, but this one gnawed at her, maybe because the man's record was oddly clean before the arrest, maybe because the crime he was accused of, murdering a local councilman, infame, a warehouse robbery gone wrong, didn't align with the man's personality, history, or finances, and maybe deep down, because she saw the way Reverend Boyd, the prison chaplain, had come to spend extra time in Jeremy's cell each week, not just praying with him, but talking like two men trying to figure out how the system had failed both of them. Jeremy had stopped asking anyone for anything in his final months, but he hadn't stopped picturing Max's big amber eyes, the ones that used to greet him every night when he came home from the night shift, and the soft tail thumps against the hardwood floor that always meant welcome, no matter how tired or broken he was. Max had been a rescue from a storm shelter, a mutt with Labrador and maybe shepherd in him, picked up the same week Jeremy proposed to Clara, and for years, the three of them had felt like a little family, even though the wedding never happened. Clara had stayed through the trial, even testified to his character, but eventually she vanished from public life, moved to Athens, and stopped replying to his letters, not out of bitterness, he assumed, but self-preservation. Still, he believed she had Max, and that somewhere in her heart she still knew he was innocent even if the courts didn't. In her small studio apartment just after 6 a.m., Clara sat at the kitchen table, staring at a grainy news report on her tablet. The headline read, "Execution scheduled for Jeremy Knox, convicted in 2018 for Councilman Stroud's murder," and as she watched the newscaster speak with chilling finality, Max lay curled by her feet, older now, his muzzle grey at the edges, one ear flopped permanently from an old injury, his breathing soft but steady. Clara reached down and ran her fingers through his fur, whispering more to herself than to him, "You still miss him too, don't you?" And Max, sensing her emotion, raised his head and offered a slow tail wag. For 5 years, she'd avoided interviews, protest marches, and podcast requests about the trial. She wanted to move on, but part of her never stopped rereading old files, never stopped questioning how the timeline made sense, how Jeremy could have been seen near the warehouse that night when his phone pinged 20 miles away, how the only witness was a teenager who changed her statement twice, and how the supposed motive, a rejected business proposal, didn't add up for a man who was already financially stable and planning a future. When her phone rang and Riverbend Correctional appeared on the caller ID, Clara's breath caught. She answered with trembling hands, and the calm, almost clinical voice of Warden Dunley introduced herself and explained the reason for the call. Jeremy Knox has requested to see his dog Max as his final wish. I've received conditional approval. If you can get here within 90 minutes, the meeting will be allowed under observation. Clara nearly dropped the phone. She looked at Max, who now stood beside her, as if understanding he was needed. Yes, I'll bring him. We'll be there. Just please wait for us, she stammered before hanging up, rushing to grab Max's leash and her truck keys, barely able to breathe. She hadn't seen Jeremy since the sentencing. Her last memory was of him in an orange jumpsuit, chains on his ankles, trying to mouth, "I'm sorry," as she sobbed into her sleeve. She hadn't known how to be strong back then, but maybe she could now. Maybe she owed it to him and to Max and to everything they once planned to be. She buckled Max into the back seat and pulled onto the highway, driving faster than usual, heart hammering with dread that they might be too late, or that some bureaucrat might reverse the decision at the last second. Max occasionally whined as if sensing the weight of the moment, and Clara kept glancing at the clock on the dashboard, whispering, "Hold on, Jeremy, just a little longer," like a mantra. Back at Riverbend, Jeremy was being moved to the execution prep cell, a sterile white room beside the injection chamber with a small observation window and a narrow metal cot. A guard named Ramirez escorted him without speaking, only pausing to uncuff and recuff him to a different bed. Jeremy asked softly, "Did they say anything about my request?" And Ramirez avoided eye contact, muttering, "They're checking. With the doc. Don't get your hopes up." Jeremy nodded, already too drained to react. He sat on the edge of the cot, staring at the floor, replaying the last time he threw Max a tennis ball, the last time Clara kissed his cheek, the last time he felt like his life belonged to him. Warden Dunley, back in her office, received confirmation that the department had agreed to the visit, so long as security protocols were followed and the dog remained under control. She picked up the phone and called the front gate. When Clara, "Santiago arrives, let her in. Escort her and the dog directly to the prep chamber. We'll allow 15 minutes. Meanwhile, just outside the prison gates, Clara's truck rolled to a stop at the first checkpoint. Max stood in the back seat, alert but calm. The guard took her ID, glanced at the clipboard, and nodded. "Go to the west entrance. They're expecting you." Clara could barely whisper thank you before shifting into drive. As she parked and opened the door, Max jumped down beside her, tail wagging but movement slower than 5 years ago. She knelt and kissed the top of his head. "You ready, boy? We're going to see him. One last time." Inside, Jeremy heard footsteps echo down the corridor and braced for the chaplain or the doctor. But the door opened and there she was, Clara, her face pale but determined, and beside her, Max, older, slower, but unmistakably his. For a second, time stopped. Jeremy's shackled hands trembled as the dog let out a bark of recognition, then a whimper, then rushed forward, dragging the leash from Clara's hand. Guards tensed, but Warden Dunley raised a hand. "Let him go!" Max bounded into Jeremy's, arms tail thumping wildly against the tile floor, his entire body vibrating with joy. Jeremy dropped to his knees, tears breaking loose for the first time in years. "Hey, buddy," he choked out, hugging Max tight, burying his face in the dog's fur. Max licked at his cheek, whined, then pressed his head into Jeremy's chest, like he was trying to say, "I never forgot you." Clara stood in the doorway watching silently, arms wrapped around herself. Jeremy looked up, his face streaked with tears. "Clara, you came." She nodded, stepping closer. "I wasn't sure they'd let me, but they called. Said you asked for him." Jeremy glanced down at Max, then back at her. "I asked for both of you." They sat together on the floor, Clara on one side of Max, Jeremy on the other. There, hands meeting briefly above the dog's back. "You still believe me?" Jeremy whispered. Clara nodded, eyes wet. "I never stopped." Warden Dunley cleared her throat. 15 minutes. Then the chaplain comes in. Jeremy nodded, stroking Max's ear. "Thank you, Warden." She gave the slightest nod and stepped out. For those 15 minutes, the world melted away. No chains, no guards, no death sentence. Just a man, a woman, and their dog, wrapped in the fragile warmth of a goodbye that might not be the end after all. The room had fallen so quiet that Jeremy could hear the rhythmic pant of Max's breathing as the dog nestled between him and Clara, like he was the thread trying to hold together, a fabric time had worked so hard to tear apart. And in that sterile, white chamber surrounded by concrete, steel and armed silence, the warmth of Max's body and the quiet presence of Clara brought a flicker of something Jeremy hadn't felt in years, peace, however temporary it might be. And as the minutes ticked by, he tried to slow down time in his head, memorizing every detail of Max's face. The flecks of white around his snout, the cloudy tint in his left eye, the way he still leaned slightly to the left like he always had when sitting, and he soaked it in like a dying man starved for sun after years in the dark, until a soft knock broke the moment, and the steel door creaked open to reveal Reverend Boyd, his Bible in one hand, his face gentle but drawn, and behind him, Warden Dunley stood with a slight nod, signaling that the visit was nearly up. Clara wiped a tear with her sleeve, leaned in to kiss Jeremy's forehead, then whispered, "I'll wait Dahum until the very end," and Jeremy, his throat tight, simply whispered back, "Tell him I love him. Tell him I'll be right there. When he dreams." And then he kissed Max on the nose, squeezing his eyes shut as the dog licked his cheek one last time, before Clara slowly rose and took the leash, her hand trembling. Max whined, resisting the pull, looking back at Jeremy with eyes that held 5 years of loyalty, and it took all of Clara's strength to coax him out of the room, knowing she might never see that look again. And as the door shut behind them, with a hollow clang, Jeremy sat back against the cold wall, the scent of Max's fur still lingering in the air, and for the first time since his arrest, he closed his eyes not in dread, but in bittersweet acceptance. Reverend Boyd approached slowly, sitting beside him with a tired groan, placing his Bible on his lap and said, "You gave that dog more love than most people ever know," to which Jeremy replied, "He gave it back 10 times over." The two men sat in silence a while before the Reverend cleared his throat. "You want to confess anything?" Jeremy shook his head. "I've told the truth 100 times. Nobody listened. I won't waste my last breath pretending now." And Boyd nodded, as if he understood all too well the futility of words in a world deafened by judgment. Meanwhile, outside the execution wing, Clara sat with Max in the prison's small visitors' lounge, her arms wrapped around him while her phone buzzed non-stop with missed calls from journalists, distant relatives, and even a podcast producer who wanted an exclusive before it's too late, all of which she ignored as she stared blankly at the institutional clock on the wall, watching the minutes blur together while Max lay silently at her feet, his head resting on her shoe like it was the only piece of home he recognized in that building. Then, just as 8 a.m. rolled around and she began to brace for the final hour, her phone buzzed again, this time with a different number, unknown but local, and something about it made her answer. The voice on the other end was hesitant, low and trembling. "Clara, this is Savannah Fields. I was the girl who testified at Jeremy's trial. I was 17 then. Please don't hang up. I need to tell you something before it's too late." Clara froze, her heart racing, and Max's ears perked up as if he sensed the shift in her energy. And after a breathless pause, Clara asked, "Why now?" And the girl's voice cracked. "Because I lied back then. I saw someone, but it wasn't Jeremy. I was scared. The detective pressured me, and then I kept quiet, but I can't anymore. I've had nightmares for years. I have to fix it." Clara stood up so fast Max lifted his head in alarm, and she walked to the hallway near the security door, whispering, "You're saying you gave false testimony? That you helped send him to death row?" And Savannah sobbed into the line, Yes, and I'll swear it. I'll sign whatever. Just tell me what to do. I didn't think they'd actually kill him. I thought he'd get life and appeal. Forever. I never thought—" Clara's hands were shaking. "Okay, stay where you are. I'm calling someone." She hung up, bolted to the front desk, and demanded to speak to Warden Dunley, who was just returning from the execution wing. "It's urgent," Clara shouted. "I just got a call, a witness from the trial. She says she lied. She says she can prove Jeremy didn't do it." The warden blinked, stunned for a moment, then looked to Officer Ramirez. "Get me the governor's office, now." The next 10 minutes were chaos. Phones ringing, files pulled, the Reverend called back mid-prayer, and Jeremy himself sat watching. The flurry through the narrow window, confused as voices echoed down the hallway, until Warden Dunley returned, flanked by Clara, a frantic legal assistant on speakerphone, and 2 guards who had clearly been called in for emergency protocol. "Jeremy," the warden said sharply, "we have a potential recantation from a key witness. The governor's office has been contacted. We're on temporary hold." Jeremy blinked in disbelief. "What?" Clara stepped forward, eyes burning. "She called me. The girl who said she saw you that night. She said she lied. She's willing to testify now. We're getting the Innocence Project involved." Jeremy's heart thudded so loudly he could barely speak. "Are you serious?" Dunley nodded. "We've paused the execution for 2 hours pending formal review, but this could change everything." The Reverend stepped back, silently mouthing a prayer as Jeremy's body slumped with a mix of shock and hope. Across the state, in a tiny motel off Route 29, Savannah paced the floor with her phone clenched, waiting for instructions, until she was told a deputy would arrive within 45 minutes to escort her to the courthouse for an emergency affidavit. She cried the whole time, muttering apologies to no one but herself, knowing her lies had nearly killed a man who had only ever tried to help her when she came into the community center, scared and broke 5 years ago, a fact she'd buried, for the sake of safety, and now could no longer live with. Back at Riverbend, Jeremy was moved from the prep room to a holding cell, unshackled and given water, while lawyers scrambled to draft emergency paperwork and submit a stay of execution request to the Supreme Court of Georgia. And Clara, standing just outside the chamber, reached down to pet Max, whispering, "You knew, didn't you? You knew he was innocent all along?" And Max licked her hand, then looked toward the hallway like he was waiting for someone. Hours passed, minutes stretching like years, until the call finally came through just after 10:30 a.m. A stay had been granted, temporary but official, pending reinvestigation of new witness testimony, and Warden Dunley stepped into the holding cell with eyes she hadn't allowed to tear in 20 years of service. "Jeremy, it's on hold. You're not dying today." Jeremy collapsed onto the cot, breathing so hard he thought he'd pass out, then whispered, "Thank you. Oh God, thank you." Clara came in with Max, who barked joyfully and jumped into his arms again, and they all sat there, man, woman, dog, and warden, as the prison clock ticked toward noon. Not into death, but maybe, just maybe, into a new beginning. And while the legal system rarely moves quickly, within 48 hours Savannah's affidavit was reviewed, a judge reopened the case, and the Innocence Project's investigators began pulling old files, interviewing detectives, and uncovering inconsistencies that had been buried under pressure, politics, and public opinion. Jeremy remained in Riverbend, but no longer in the death wing. His status changed to hold pending review, and though he was still technically an inmate, the guards stopped treating him like a dead man walking. Clara came to visit every week now, bringing Max when allowed, and they'd sit together in the same visitor's room where she once waited to say goodbye, watching the dog nap beside them as they talked not just about the past, but about what might come next. Jeremy had spent 5 years preparing to die, but now, for the first time in a long time, he began wondering what it might feel like to live, and how, if he ever walked out of Riverbend as a free man, the first place he'd go would be the trail. In Augusta, where he used to walk Max at sunset, back when things were simple and the world still made sense. The days that followed Jeremy's stay of execution passed like a dream he was afraid to wake from, and while his cell was still narrow and his jumpsuit still orange, everything felt different now. The guards no longer looked at him like a dead man. The chaplain no longer prayed like time was running out, and even the way Max greeted him during their brief supervised visits felt lighter, more hopeful, as if the dog could sense that his human might not vanish forever behind concrete walls. Meanwhile, Clara split her days between home and courthouse, between old file boxes and phone calls, piecing together a puzzle she had nearly buried 5 years earlier, and each night she returned exhausted, emotionally worn, but with Max curled beside her on the couch. She'd feel enough strength to try again tomorrow, because tomorrow mattered now not as a countdown, but as a doorway. Savannah Fields, the once teenage witness who had just upended the justice system with her confession, had become the unexpected center of a legal storm that few had seen coming. Within 3 days of her affidavit, Jeremy's defense attorneys, supported by the Atlanta Innocence Project, filed a formal motion to vacate his conviction, citing suppressed evidence, witness coercion, and conflicting forensic timelines that had been ignored during the original trial, and as public interest reignited, news vans returned to Riverbend's entrance, this time not for an execution but for a possible exoneration. Reporters, many of whom had once painted Jeremy as a cold-blooded killer, now scrambled to explain how the system might have failed him, while talk shows debated whether the justice system was broken or just badly bruised. And in the middle of it all, Jeremy sat quietly in his holding cell, not reading the headlines, not watching the news, but waiting for the next visit with Clara and Max, because in their presence he felt like a person again, not a file number or a mugshot, just Jeremy, the guy who used to teach obedience classes at the park on Saturdays, who'd hoped to build a dog training business with the woman he loved, and who still remembered the way Max used to sneak onto the couch, despite all the rules they pretended to enforce. During one visit, as Clara recounted a breakthrough her team had uncovered, surveillance footage from a gas station half a mile from the crime scene showing a man in a red hoodie fleeing the direction of the warehouse at 2:14 a.m., the exact time of the councilman's murder. A man who was definitely not Jeremy. He felt something inside him start to thaw, like the cold grip of injustice that had clenched his chest for half a decade was finally beginning to loosen, and he looked at Clara with a kind of reverence, whispering, Why didn't you give up on me?" And she smiled, running her hand through Max's fur as he dozed between them, and answered, "Because Max didn't, and because the truth doesn't. Stop being true just because no one believes it." Meanwhile, on the legal front, things accelerated. The Red Hoodie man, once dismissed as a bystander in the original police report, was now being sought as a person of interest, and when the footage was enhanced and circulated, a local tip came in. Someone recognized him. Darnell Kincaid, a low-level ex-con who had worked for a warehouse cleaning contractor and had vanished from Augusta 6 days after the murder. This revelation cracked the case open, prompting a subpoena for his former employer's records and a request for cell phone location data that had never been obtained during the original investigation. When those records showed Kincaid's phone, pinged at the warehouse site minutes before the alarm was triggered, and Jeremy's phone, by contrast, pinged 24 miles away near his apartment, the state had no choice but to begin formal proceedings to review the conviction for potential reversal. Public sentiment shifted fast, and soon Jeremy's face appeared not just in headlines, but in online petitions demanding accountability for those who had pushed his conviction forward despite flimsy evidence, most notably Detective Wesley Garth, who had since retired, but whose aggressive interrogation of Savannah and intentional omission of exculpatory forensic reports were now under fire from civil rights lawyers and media watchdogs. Garth, when tracked down by a journalist, refused comment, but insiders said he had already hired a defense attorney, sensing what might come next. Meanwhile, Jeremy's legal team prepared for a hearing unlike any they'd had before, not a plea for mercy, but a demand for justice. Clara stood by them at every step, helping build a timeline, revisiting old court transcripts, even locating the garage mechanic who had worked on Jeremy's car the week of the murder, who testified that it couldn't have made the trip to the warehouse and back because of a broken water pump, a fact never introduced in the original trial. All of it began forming a mosaic, each tile fitting together to paint a picture of wrongful conviction, not out of malicious conspiracy, but from rushed assumptions, career ambition, and a system that too often values a conviction over the truth. The day of the emergency evidentiary hearing arrived under a sky as heavy and grey as the one on the morning of the scheduled execution, but this time Jeremy didn't wear shackles, and he didn't walk alone. Clara was there, holding his hand as they entered the courtroom, and Max, dressed in a service dog vest, was permitted to sit by the witness box, his eyes scanning the crowd like he knew this was his moment too. The gallery was packed. Reporters, advocates, law students, and even former jurors who had come after hearing Savannah's public apology, some in tears. Judge Hannah Whitford, a no-nonsense jurist known for her tough sentencing but fair hearings, presided with quiet authority as Jeremy's lawyer, Marvin Weathers, laid out the full sequence of new evidence, supported by Savannah's tearful live testimony in which she confessed that Detective Garth had told her, "Just say it was the guy in the picture. You'll be helping your city. No one's going to get hurt." And how at 17, alone and scared, she had gone along with it because she didn't understand the weight of what she was doing, until years later, when the guilt wouldn't let her sleep, and she found herself writing letters she never sent to Clara, trying to explain, trying to undo what had already been done. The courtroom held its breath as prosecutors conceded they could not defend the conviction under these new facts, and Judge Whitford took a recess, not to deliberate guilt, but to prepare her ruling on whether Jeremy's record should be formally vacated and the state ordered to release him, pending full reinvestigation. Outside, crowds had gathered, holding signs like "Free Jeremy" and "Justice delayed is justice denied," and when the court resumed, the judge read her ruling with steady resolve. This court finds that the original conviction of Mr. Jeremy Knox was rendered under conditions that substantially violated his constitutional rights. Effective immediately, the conviction is vacated. Mr. Knox is to be released pending further review. Bail is waived. Case is reopened. The courtroom erupted. Clara gasped and covered her mouth. Max barked once and thumped his tail against the bench, and Jeremy, frozen in his seat, only believed it when the bailiff unlatched his cuff and said, "You're a free man, sir." Outside, cameras flashed and microphones stretched like antennae, but Jeremy didn't stop for interviews. He dropped to his knees beside Max and hugged him so tightly the dog let out a happy yelp, and Clara crouched beside them, tears rolling down her cheeks as she whispered, "Let's go home." And for the first time in years, that word meant something. The drive back to Augusta felt like passing through a dream. Fields, gas stations, rest stops, all blurred by the speed of a life rushing back into motion. And when they reached Clara's house, a cozy 2-bedroom she'd moved into after the trial, Jeremy stood outside the front door for a long moment before stepping in, the feel of carpet under his feet strange and soft, the smell of coffee and dog shampoo oddly comforting, and Max trotted ahead like he was giving a tour of the life Jeremy had been denied, jumping onto the couch, pawing at his old chew toy like to say, "See, I kept it safe." That night they didn't talk much. They ate pizza on paper plates, curled on the couch with Max between them, and stared at the TV without really watching it, too full of everything to speak. It wasn't until after midnight, when Clara rested her head on Jeremy's shoulder and whispered, "Do you feel free yet?" that he shook his head and replied, "Not yet, but this feels like the first breath in years," and she nodded, lacing her fingers through his and said, "Then we'll breathe together until it feels real." The weeks that followed were full of transition, media interviews, lawsuits filed against the county, and a civil case launched by Jeremy's legal team for wrongful conviction, citing emotional damage, lost income, and 5 years of psychological trauma, a case that would take months, maybe years, but which Jeremy intended to pursue not for the money but for change, so that no one else would go through what he had without someone speaking up for them. Still, not everything was courtroom battles and lawyer meetings. There were quiet walks in the park with Max trotting beside them, old friends returning with tearful apologies, and new routines formed around morning coffee, evening news, and whispered dreams about what might come next, like the dog training business Jeremy and Clara had once planned, now renamed Second Chance Canine, a place for shelter dogs and ex-inmates to find healing together. And though it started as a dream on the back of a napkin, it quickly gained traction when a local news station ran a feature, and donations poured in from people who saw not just a man wronged, but a man reborn. One morning, as Jeremy stood outside the training yard, watching Max lead a group of skittish rescues through their first obedience drills, Clara stepped beside him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and said, "You know what today is?" Jeremy shook his head. "What?" She smiled. "Exactly 1 year since your last day on death row." He turned to her, kissed her forehead, and said, "Feels like a lifetime ago." She nodded. "That's because you started living again. The moment you walked out those gates." And he looked at Max, sun catching the grey in his fur, tail wagging with purpose, and whispered, "And I'll never waste another second of it." For the first time in 6 years, Jeremy Knox no longer woke up to the screech of prison gates or the harsh clang of metal doors, but instead to the soft thump of Max's tail hitting the side of the bed, the aroma of brewing coffee drifting from the kitchen, and the sunlight filtering through real curtains in a real home. And while freedom didn't erase everything he'd endured, it gave him something else, something harder to define, but even more precious: space to heal, to rediscover himself beyond the chains of a name once tied to a crime he never committed. In the early weeks following his release, the transition was anything but smooth. The world had moved on without him, and navigating it felt like walking across a frozen lake with invisible cracks underneath. The simplest things were suddenly overwhelming, like the noise of traffic, the feel of a smartphone screen, or the awkward way strangers stared at him when they recognized his face from the news, some offering awkward condolences, others hiding judgment behind forced smiles, and more than once he had to step away from a grocery aisle or a gas station pump just to catch his breath and remember that he wasn't trapped anymore. Clara, always patient, always perceptive, never pushed. She simply stayed close, listened when he was ready to talk, and filled in the blanks of all he'd missed, from the passing of neighbors to the closure of their favorite old diner. And most nights, they ended their long, quiet evenings curled up with Max on the couch, watching reruns or scrolling through photos of shelter dogs in need of training, slowly building the foundation for the dream they had promised each other years. Ergo, Second Chance Canine, a sanctuary for animals and people who'd been through too much and needed a place to start again. At first, the business existed only as scribbled notes on index cards and email drafts saved on Clara's laptop, but the story of Jeremy's exoneration and his bond with Max had struck a chord far beyond Georgia. People from across the country, and even overseas, began sending messages, donations, and letters of support, from former inmates who found hope in his survival, to dog lovers who understood the quiet, unspoken therapy a loyal animal could provide. And one of those letters came from a retired Vietnam veteran named Curtis, who had spent decades training PTSD service dogs in Virginia and offered to drive down, help get things started, and volunteer for as long as needed. Jeremy was stunned by the generosity, but Clara reminded him with a smile, "You didn't ask for this kindness. You earned it by surviving without turning bitter." And Jeremy, still adjusting to compliments that didn't come with handcuffs, simply nodded and said, "Let's make sure we give back more than we take." Within 3 months, they secured a lease on a rundown farm outside Augusta. 10 acres, 3 barns, and a main house that smelled of mildew and lost time, but to Jeremy and Clara, it looked like redemption. And with the help of friends, volunteers, and even a few former cellmates Jeremy had stayed in touch with, they began transforming the land. The barns were gutted and cleaned, fences were repaired, and a portion of the field was converted into a fenced agility course with painted wood planks, tire tunnels, and a sandbox for digging, all built with scrap, sweat, and stories traded over gallons of lemonade and country music drifting from an old Bluetooth speaker. Max, now 11, might not have had the energy of his younger years, but he walked the grounds each day like a supervisor, sniffing every post, greeting every visitor, and occasionally joining training sessions to help the more anxious dogs calm down. His presence enough to ease their trembling paws and hesitant barks. The grand opening was set for a sunny Saturday in April, and Clara designed flyers with a picture of Jeremy and Max under the words "Second Chance Canine, where healing begins," posting them in cafes, vet offices, and community centers across the county. And on the morning of the launch, they woke up early to find a line of cars already forming near the dirt driveway. Families with rescued dogs, veterans with service animals, even local judges and lawyers who had quietly followed. Jeremy's case and now came to show support without cameras or speeches, just quiet nods and handshakes that meant everything. Jeremy stood at the front gate, flanked by Clara and Max, overwhelmed by the turnout, and when a young boy with autism approached holding a shy terrier mix named Scout, Jeremy knelt beside him and gently asked if he wanted to try the obstacle. "Course." The boy nodded slowly, and for the next 10 minutes Scout and the boy ran side by side while Max followed behind at a leisurely pace, and Jeremy realized this was the life he'd dreamed of in his cell. Not fame, not revenge, just moments like this, a quiet, meaningful, real. But freedom wasn't without its ghosts, and they came back to visit when the nights grew too still, sometimes in the form of dreams where the execution chamber returned, the sound of the syringe plunger echoing before he jolted awake in a sweat, other times in the form of sudden flashbacks triggered by loud voices or locked doors, and it was during one of those moments, sitting alone in the barn with Max pressed against his leg, that Jeremy decided to write his story down. Not as a tell-all or a legal breakdown, but as a letter to his younger self, the man who once believed that justice was infallible and life was predictable. He wrote late into the night, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing at memories he'd nearly forgotten, like the time Max chased a raccoon into the neighbor's kiddie pool, or the way Clara once faked a twisted ankle to get out of meeting. His old college buddies, and when the manuscript was done, Clara helped him find a local publisher who agreed to print 1,000 copies as part of a community book initiative. And within weeks of its release, The Day I Didn't Die became a regional bestseller, with book clubs and high school teachers reaching out to include it in curriculum about justice, empathy, and resilience. The media attention returned, this time kinder, more thoughtful. Jeremy appeared on a few morning shows, soft-spoken and measured, always redirecting the spotlight back to Max and Second Chance Canine, because to him, the story wasn't about what was taken, it was about what was rebuilt. But not everyone was ready to celebrate. A lawsuit filed against the county, the police department, and Detective Garth moved forward. And though Jeremy had no thirst for vengeance, his attorneys reminded him that accountability mattered, that justice wasn't real unless those who abused it were made to answer for what they did. And so Jeremy attended the depositions, gave statements, and watched as Garth, older and quieter now, finally admitted under oath that pressure from city officials and a re-election campaign had led him to push Savannah's testimony forward, despite doubts, an admission that led to a formal reprimand, a settlement agreement, and a public apology, read aloud by the county commissioner during a press conference Jeremy refused to attend, choosing instead to spend the afternoon planting flowers beside the training yard. Max, laying in the shade nearby with his nose twitching in the breeze. By summer, the sanctuary was thriving. They'd trained 23 dogs, rehomed 18, and helped 3 formerly incarcerated trainers gain certification and part-time jobs at nearby shelters. And every weekend, Clara hosted adoption fairs with lemonade, stands and food trucks, turning the once-forgotten farm into a hub of healing and community joy. Then one evening, as they sat on the back porch watching Max doze under the porch light, Clara turned to Jeremy and said, "You know what we haven't done?" He looked over. "What's that?" She smiled. "Taken a real vacation. Just you, me and Max. Somewhere with water, somewhere quiet." Jeremy laughed, surprised by how much the idea filled him with nervous excitement. "Where?" She leaned her head on his shoulder. "There's a cabin near Blue Ridge, lakefront, pet-friendly, no phone signal." He paused. "Sounds perfect." And 2 weeks later, they packed up the truck, loaded Max into the back seat with his favorite blanket, and drove north, the road winding through forests, past rivers and valleys, until they reached a small, wooden cabin surrounded by tall pines and the soft hush of nature. For 3 days they cooked over a fire pit, swam in the lake, and read books on the deck while Max snored at their feet, and on the last night, as fireflies danced over the water, and the stars blinked down like old friends, Jeremy took Clara's hand, pulled a small ring from his pocket and whispered, "I lost time, but I didn't lose you. Marry me." And through tears and laughter she said yes, and Max barked once as if to seal the deal. And in that moment the world finally felt right, not because everything was perfect, but because they had survived, rebuilt and found joy again in the simplest things. A dog's loyalty, a woman's faith, and a man's choice to live, not in bitterness, but in love. The drive back from the cabin was quiet, not in the way that silence fills empty space, but in the way peace settles into every corner after something long, hard, and painful has finally made sense. Jeremy kept one hand on the steering wheel, and the other resting on Clara's, as Max snoozed in the back seat with his muzzle twitching every so often, like he was still chasing something in a dream. And even though the highway stretched ahead in long, flat ribbons of grey, every mile felt like something new, not just a return but a restart. Back at the sanctuary, things had carried on while they were gone, thanks to a rotating crew of volunteers, including Curtis, the veteran, now basically family, who reported that 2 new rescues had arrived, one a terrified boxer with trust issues, the other a hyper little pit lab mix who chewed through 3 leashes before they found the right harness. And when Jeremy walked back through the gates with his arm around Clara and Max trotting proudly beside them, the dogs barked, and the staff smiled like their family had come home. The following weeks rolled into summer, and the sanctuary gained traction on social media, not because they tried, but because someone had posted a heartfelt video of Jeremy helping a trembling shepherd learn to trust again, and the sight of a man once condemned to die now, teaching a forgotten dog how to live, struck something deep in viewers across the country. Soon local reporters came back, not with hard questions but open curiosity. They asked about his vision, his daily routines, how Max was holding up in his older age, and Jeremy answered each question with humility and gratitude, always careful. To say the sanctuary wasn't just about him, it was about second chances for everyone, whether human or hound, and that no one should be defined by the worst day of their life. Clara handled the back end, donations, adoption screenings, vet appointments, while Jeremy focused on training, spending hours each day on the field with leashes, treats, and commands, and no matter how tough the dog, Max was never far away, his steady presence often doing more to calm a nervous animal than any spoken word ever could. Then one afternoon in late August, while helping a teenager named Malik, a shy, lanky kid recently released from juvenile detention, Jeremy noticed Max moving slower than usual, favoring his right side and breathing a little heavier, and, though he tried not to panic, something in his gut twisted as Max lay down under the shade tree and didn't get back up until Jeremy came over and coaxed him gently. He and Clara took Max to the vet the next morning, where an ultrasound and blood work confirmed what they feared. Max had an enlarged heart and a mass near his liver, likely cancerous, and while there was no guarantee of how much time they had left, the vet gave them a quiet look that said, "Prepare yourselves." The ride home was silent. Clara driving this time, Jeremy in the passenger seat with Max's head resting on his lap, tears rolling down his cheeks as he whispered, "Not yet, buddy. Please, not yet." They cleared Max's schedule, stopped bringing him to the field, and turned the living room into a quiet sanctuary of its own, soft blankets, his favorite toys, and a water bowl within reach. And each day, Jeremy lay beside him, talking, petting, and reminiscing about the years they'd shared, the trials they'd survived, and the home they'd built together. Clara found herself watching them in those quiet hours, heart aching as she realized Max had not just been a dog or a symbol. He was the glue, the soul of everything they'd managed to hold on to when life tried to tear it all apart. As word spread about Max's condition, the community responded in droves. Neighbors left flowers at the gate, kids drew pictures of Max playing in the fields, and someone anonymously donated a handcrafted bench engraved with the words, "For Max, the dog who taught us all how to stay." Jeremy installed it beneath the shade tree where Max used to nap, and every evening after feeding time, he'd sit there with Max at his feet, watching the sun dip low over the grass, his hand resting gently on the dog's side, listening to his breathing like it was music he couldn't afford to forget. Then on a Thursday morning in mid-September, just after sunrise, Max didn't wake up. Jeremy had fallen asleep with his head on Max's shoulder, and when he opened his eyes to the soft glow of dawn, he knew before he checked that Max had passed quietly in the night, his body still warm, his eyes closed like he'd simply drifted into a better place. Jeremy didn't cry at first, not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain was so deep, so sharp, it hadn't even reached the surface yet. He carried Max himself, wrapped in the blanket they'd brought home from the cabin, and laid him beneath the shade tree where the bench sat waiting. Then he dug the grave by hand, refusing help from anyone, and when it was done, Clara joined him to lay Max down, pressing her lips to his fur one last time, as Jeremy whispered, "You saved me," over and over. "Thank you." They buried Max beneath the tree, planted sunflowers around the mound, and held a quiet memorial that weekend where over 100 people, adopters, volunteers, supporters, came to pay tribute, many bringing their dogs, some of whom had been trained by Jeremy with Max beside him, and as the breeze rustled through the tall grass, Jeremy stood before them and shared the words he'd written in his journal the night after Max died. "We don't get to choose our endings, but if we're lucky, we get to choose how we live until they come. Max gave me the courage to live, so now I will honor him by helping others learn to do the same." After that, the sanctuary's mission deepened. They started a special program called Max's Legacy, pairing senior dogs with elderly or disabled adopters, providing training, supplies, and even home visits to ensure successful transitions. And the program exploded in popularity, receiving national attention from a major animal welfare organization that offered a grant to expand their facilities and build an on-site clinic. As construction began, Jeremy found himself waking each day not with grief but with purpose. He missed Max, sometimes so deeply it stole his breath, but he also felt him everywhere, in the wag of a tail, the quiet trust of a nervous pup, the way Clara smiled when a training breakthrough happened, and he often spoke to Max under the shade tree, thanking him for every gift he'd left behind. Then one evening, as the sun painted the sky in gold and the wind smelled faintly of pine, Clara placed a tiny black puppy in Jeremy's arms. She was barely 10 weeks old, rescued from a storm drain, trembling but curious, and when she looked up at him with big dark eyes, Jeremy laughed through his tears and said, "Hi there, you've got big paws to fill," and the puppy licked his chin in response. They named her Nova, meaning new beginning, and as she settled into their home, Jeremy felt the slow return of joy, not the same as before, but no less real, a reminder that love didn't replace loss, but grew around it. Months passed, and the sanctuary thrived. The new clinic opened, Nova grew into a sleek, smart companion who shadowed Jeremy like Max once had, and the field under the shade tree became sacred ground, a place where adopters took photos, where kids read to therapy dogs, and where Jeremy often sat on the bench, hands folded, heart full. Clara and Jeremy married in a simple ceremony beneath the sunflowers, surrounded by dogs and friends, Max's old collar tied around Clara's bouquet, and when the judge asked if he had anything to say before the vows, Jeremy looked out at the gathering and said, "All I ever needed to survive this life was already in it. Love, loyalty, and a reason to keep going. I found all three right here." And there wasn't a dry eye as Clara kissed him beneath a sky that finally felt safe. And though time moved on and seasons changed, some things never did, like Jeremy's morning walks across the sanctuary grounds, Nova trotting beside him, his eyes always drifting toward the tree where it all began, where the dog who once saved his soul now rested in peace, watching from beyond, proud, eternal, and never forgotten. Fall settled slowly across the Georgia countryside, its arrival marked not by any dramatic shift, but by the soft turning of leaves from green to rust, the way the air in the early mornings carried a whisper of chill, and how the sun now dipped lower behind the trees a little earlier each evening. And on the grounds of Second Chance Canine, that change in season brought with it a kind of rhythm, a quiet understanding that even the most vibrant days make room for endings, and that the endings themselves are often what allow new stories to begin. Jeremy felt it most during his walks with Nova, who had grown from a trembling storm drain rescue into a confident, whip-smart companion with a mischievous streak and eyes that always searched for his approval. She reminded him of Max in a dozen little ways, but also stood entirely on her own, different in spirit and speed, the kind of dog who would leap into a pond before checking the depth, and Jeremy loved that about her, that reckless joy, that blind trust, that reminder that life was still full of firsts waiting to be found. Each morning, as the sanctuary stirred to life, trainers arriving, dogs barking greetings, coffee brewing in the volunteer cabin, Jeremy and Nova walked the perimeter, checking gates, inspecting the new agility ramps they'd built in honor of Max. greeting early risers and sometimes pausing by the old shade tree, where the grass had grown soft and wild around the bench, where people still left tokens, a collar here, a poem there, even a child's drawing of Max with wings. Jeremy often sat on that bench, letting Nova curl beside his feet and just breathed, because some days just breathing without panic or pain was still a miracle. Clara, now his wife and the heart of the operation, managed everything from legal paperwork to community events, and had begun expanding their outreach program with local shelters, jails, and youth centers. Dogs don't just heal people, she often said during her workshops, they reveal them, who they are, what they need, what they've hidden too long. And more than once, Jeremy had stood in the back of a room, listening to her speak, feeling this surge of love that made him forget how much time they'd lost and only remember how much they'd saved. But peace, however earned, is never permanent. And one Wednesday afternoon in October, as the team worked on winterizing the kennels, a letter arrived from the Georgia Board of Compensation, stamped with the state seal, and a heavy silence Jeremy could feel before he even opened it. He read it alone, standing in the office doorway while Nova gnawed lazily on a rope toy beside his boots, and as his eyes moved across the page, his breath caught. They were denying the final phase of his compensation claim, citing insufficient procedural error, despite the overturned conviction and wrongful imprisonment ruling. Clara found him still holding the letter, his jaw clenched, shoulders tight, and when she took the paper from him and read it, her mouth fell open in disbelief. After everything? They're really going to do this? She asked, and Jeremy didn't answer at first because he wasn't angry in the way she was, not anymore. He was tired, not of fighting for truth, but of how often truth had to fight for itself. They sat on the porch that night in silence, watching Nova chase leaves across the yard, and when Jeremy finally spoke, it was quiet and certain. I'm not going to court again, not for them, not to beg for what they already know they owe, but I'll speak. I'll let the world hear it if they won't. So he wrote, not a legal appeal this time, but a speech, a letter, an open hand stretched to the country that watched him nearly die for a lie, and he published it through a non-profit civil rights platform under the title The Cost of Being Forgotten, and it went viral in days, not because it was angry, but because it was calm, thoughtful, impossible to ignore. He didn't name names, didn't shame the system, but told his story again in quiet detail, how it felt to hear the cell doors lock for the first time, to count down his final days with a dog he'd never expected to see again, to be told we were wrong without hearing we're sorry, and to build something beautiful from the pieces of a life almost destroyed. Letters poured in from students, senators, prisoners, pastors, strangers, and within a week, the Georgia House Judiciary Committee scheduled a public hearing to review the policies surrounding wrongful conviction compensation and asked Jeremy to testify in person. It was the same courthouse where he'd once been sentenced to death, and walking through those doors again felt like diving into ice. But Nova was beside him, wearing her service vest, and Clara held his hand, so tight he couldn't slip even if he wanted to. The chamber was packed, media in the back, advocates near the front, and when Jeremy stood and adjusted the mic, he waited for the room to go silent before speaking. My name is Jeremy Knox. I was convicted of a murder I didn't commit. I spent 5 years preparing to die for it. I lost time, freedom, family, and nearly lost my own life. I got it back, but not everyone does. And today I'm not asking you for money, I'm asking you not to forget people like me once the headlines fade. By the end, the room was still, even the lawmakers quiet as he stepped down and returned to his seat, Nova nudging his leg gently like she knew he needed grounding. In the weeks that followed, a bill was introduced, co-sponsored by both parties, proposing automatic compensation for all overturned wrongful convictions in the state of Georgia, along with access to therapy, housing, and employment support. The Knox Act, they called it, and Jeremy had to laugh at that, because all he ever wanted was for Max to be remembered, not himself. But if his name helped someone else avoid what he'd endured, then maybe it was worth it. Meanwhile, back at the sanctuary, things grew, not in the loud, flashy way of business empires, but in the slow, steady way of gardens. New trainers joined. More rescues arrived, and they added a tiny on-site library with books about grief, hope, and healing, plus a coffee machine that never quite worked right, but still became the favorite hangout for staff during long days. Nova had her own following now. People came just to see her in action, to watch how she handled nervous pups, how she seemed to know when someone needed a quiet lean or a playful nudge, and Jeremy often found himself staring at her with awe, wondering how life had placed another miracle in his path after taking so much away. Then, in early December, a woman named Bernice arrived with a case that tugged hard at Jeremy's heart. She was in her 60s, a widow, living on disability, and had just lost her elderly dog, who'd been her only company since her husband passed. She didn't want a puppy, she said softly, just someone to sit with her, maybe keep her warm on cold nights. And that's when Jeremy introduced her to Samson, a 10-year-old Rottweiler mix who had a limp, a quiet spirit, and eyes full of gentleness. Watching Bernice and Samson meet was like watching two puzzle pieces click into place, and when she cried while signing the papers, Jeremy sat beside her and said, "This isn't the end of anything. It's the start of a new chapter for both of you." And she squeezed his hand, whispering, "God bless you, son, you're doing holy work here." Christmas came quietly that year. No big celebration, just a bonfire, cocoa, and dogs wearing reindeer ears as staff gathered around to share stories, laughter, and what they were grateful for. And when it was Jeremy's turn, he said, "I'm grateful for every minute I almost didn't have, and for every soul, human and dog, that found their way here because of it." And Nova, wearing a crooked red scarf, barked once like she agreed. The sanctuary closed for one day, just Christmas Day, and Jeremy and Clara spent it at home, eating pancakes in pajamas, playing fetch in the frosty backyard, and watching old home videos Clara had saved. Clips of Max as a puppy, of Jeremy teaching him to stay with hilarious failure, of that one beach trip where Max stole a stranger's sandwich and ran 3 blocks with it. And they laughed until they cried, holding each other close, not needing presents because they had this, memory, healing, and the precious miracle of more time. As the year turned, snow came, rare in Georgia but beautiful, coating the fields in white and turning the training yard into a sparkling canvas of frozen wonder. And Nova, never one to miss a chance at chaos, dove into the snowbanks like a cannonball while the younger dogs watched, stunned, before joining in one by one, until the sanctuary rang with the sound of barking, laughter, and the unmistakable joy of lives fully lived. Jeremy stood at the top of the hill watching it all and felt a strange sensation rise in him, not grief, not even relief, but something deeper, something he hadn't dared believe in for years, peace, real and present, the kind that lives quietly beneath the surface and only rises when you're still enough to hear it. Winter melted slowly into spring that year, not all at once like in the movies, but in careful little moments. The thaw of frost on the barn roof, the return of muddy paw prints on the porch steps, the first stubborn daffodil poking its head up near the shade tree where Max rested beneath a blanket of sunflowers, and with it came new challenges, new decisions, and the quiet weight of forward motion, because even when life gets better, it doesn't stop being life. And Jeremy knew, by now, that peace wasn't a place you arrived at, but something you fought to hold on to a little more each day. The sanctuary had grown larger than he ever expected, not just in size but in reach. Social media followers passed 100,000, the adoption rate had doubled, and news crews continued to stop by with cameras and notepads, eager to cover what they called a beacon of hope in the South. But Jeremy had never liked that phrase, because it made it sound like they were some polished miracle story instead of what they really were. Survivors, improvisers, people with scar tissue, who still got up every morning and chose to keep going. He never let the fame distract him, never let it become more important than the work. He was still out in the fields every day with mud on his jeans and treats in his pocket, helping a snappy rescue learn to trust a leash again, or teaching. A fresh volunteer. The difference between nervous barking and aggressive behavior, and Nova always one step behind or ahead, depending on the moment, had taken over Max's old role of calm center. Though she was more playful, more bold, the kind of dog who'd splash through puddles and lick your face unapologetically, even after knocking over your coffee. But she'd grown into her own kind of legend at the sanctuary, and everyone knew that if Nova took to a dog, it meant they were ready to trust a human again. Clara, now managing a growing staff and juggling grant proposals, community partnerships, and a new podcast she co-hosted with a local therapist about healing after trauma, had become not just Jeremy's wife and partner, but a quiet voice of leadership in the region. People reached out to her not just for dog training advice, but for wisdom about grief, resilience, and starting again after the worst. Together, they navigated the complex rhythm of a life rebuilt, days filled with barking, laughter, meetings, and the occasional heartbreak that still caught them off guard, like when an old dog they'd poured their hearts into passed away, before finding a home, or when a former inmate trainer relapsed and disappeared without warning, leaving behind only a voicemail that said, "I'm sorry, I just don't know how to live free." Those moments hurt more than Jeremy let on, but he never let them stop him. Instead, he poured that ache into the work, into one more training session, one more walk, one more letter of encouragement to a man or woman behind bars who'd written, after hearing his story, asking, "How do I survive what they did to me?" And Jeremy always replied honestly, telling them, "You hold on to what's real, and when everything else is stripped away, what's real is love. Someone who still sees you, a dog who still waits, the fire that says not yet, not like this." Then one day in early April, a call came in from a non-profit in Arizona asking if they'd be willing to consult on a similar sanctuary project starting near Flagstaff. They wanted to bring Jeremy and Clara out for a week, cover the costs, introduce them to a team of veterans and formerly incarcerated people launching their own program. And Jeremy was hesitant at first, not because he didn't want to help, but because he hated the idea of leaving the sanctuary, even temporarily. But Clara encouraged him, saying, "We've built something that runs without us now. That's the dream, remember? That it doesn't fall apart if we step away, that it grows because we taught it how." So they packed bags, left Nova in the capable hands of Curtis and the senior staff, and flew west, watching the Georgia pines turn to Arizona deserts, the air drier, thinner, but no less full of purpose. And when they arrived at the new site, they were stunned by how familiar it all felt. The anxious dogs, the hopeful eyes, the smell of fresh lumber and red dirt, and the people, all of them carrying the invisible weight of survival, but showing up anyway, ready to build something better. Jeremy led workshops, shared stories, helped design the agility course, and spent hours one-on-one with trainers who had stories like his. A woman who served 15 years before DNA freed her, a young man who had grown up in a gang before, finding refuge in a shelter dog named Tango, who never left his side. By the end of the week, Jeremy felt something shift, not just in them, but in himself, like the work had outgrown him in the best possible way, like it didn't need him to be the face of it anymore, just the root. On the flight home, he looked at Clara and said, "What if we made this bigger?" And she smiled before he could finish. "You mean more sanctuaries?" He nodded. "What if there was one in every state, not owned by us, just supported, trained by what we learned, like a network, a family?" And she squeezed his hand, whispering, "That's not a dream, that's a plan." Back in Georgia, they got to work. They didn't announce it publicly, didn't launch a flashy campaign, just started laying the foundation, outlining a certification program, documenting their training philosophy, creating startup guides for sanctuary design and trauma-informed practice, and called it Max's Circle, a network of independent sanctuaries committed to healing dogs and people together, with Second Chance Canine as its hub. They funded the first 5 themselves, small grants, careful vetting, and within a year, sanctuaries sprouted in North Carolina, Oregon, Michigan, Texas, and Louisiana, each one unique, but carrying the same heart, the same principles, the same promise that broken doesn't mean ruined and that survival is just the start of the story. Jeremy and Clara began traveling more, hosting annual gatherings at the Georgia farm, where sanctuary leaders came together to share updates, strategies, and sometimes just tears over dogs lost and lives changed. Nova, now a little grayer around the muzzle, was present for everyone, still queen of the yard, still the soul of the place. And when a little boy at the 5th annual gathering asked Jeremy, "Was she your first dog?" Jeremy knelt down, smiled softly and said, "No, kiddo, she's my second chance. My first was a big, gentle goofball named Max. He saved my life. Nova's helping me live it." But even as the sanctuary movement grew, Jeremy never lost sight of the individual moments, the quiet ones, like sitting with a new volunteer who just got out of prison and didn't know how to hold a leash, or walking with a dog who'd been returned 3 times and was starting to lose hope, or whispering "you're not alone" to someone who showed up on the verge of quitting everything. He didn't need cameras or applause. He needed that one look in a dog's eyes when they realized they were safe, that one breath from a trainer when they realized they mattered again, that one sunrise that didn't feel like a sentence but a start. Life wasn't perfect. There were setbacks, storm damage, funding scares, a tough year when 2 staff members got sick, and the whole schedule fell apart. But each time the community stepped in, volunteers stayed late, donations came through, and the sanctuary held strong. Clara often said, "This place isn't made of buildings, it's made of people who didn't give up." And Jeremy knew she was right, because long after the reporters stopped calling and the awards gathered dust on a forgotten shelf, what mattered was the daily choice to keep going, to show up, to believe that love, quiet, stubborn, dog-eared love, could still save the world one soul at a time. The summer that followed marked the 5-year anniversary of Jeremy Knox's release from prison, though he didn't mark it with candles or celebration, just a quiet morning walk across the sanctuary grounds with Nova at his side, and the weight of reflection pressing against his ribs like the Georgia humidity. 5 years of freedom that still felt borrowed some days. 5 years of rebuilding, of healing, of planting something solid in a world that once tried to erase him. And as the sun lifted above the treetops, casting golden light across the training yard, where 2 new dogs played under the supervision of a recent graduate named Daryl, a man Jeremy had once written letters to while he served time in Tennessee, he couldn't help but feel the strange tug of time, how it curved and bent, and sometimes gave back what it took away, though never in the shape you expected. Daryl waved from the field, and Jeremy waved back, smiling at how far the sanctuary had come. Max's circle had expanded to 12 states now, with over 50 dogs trained and adopted through the network just this year alone, and each week brought a new story, a new victory, a new reminder that what they'd built here had grown into something far bigger than themselves. And yet, even in the glow of progress, life had its own way of keeping balance, of reminding them that no path is without its valleys, and that reminder came in late July, when Clara began feeling off. Nothing dramatic at first, just fatigue. A tightness in her chest she brushed off as stress or the southern heat, but Jeremy noticed, as he always did, how she winced when lifting boxes, how her laughter dimmed a little around the edges, and though she insisted she was fine, he convinced her to go in for a checkup, just to rule things out. They drove together to the small clinic in Augusta, the same one where Max had once been diagnosed, and Clara teased him gently about being a worry wart, but her hand squeezed his tighter than usual as they sat in the waiting room. What started as routine spiraled quickly. Blood work turned into a chest X-ray, which turned into a CT scan, and within a week they were sitting across from a specialist who gently, clinically, told them Clara had early-stage lymphoma, slow-growing, but serious, requiring a series of treatments over the next several months. The word hit Jeremy like a sledgehammer wrapped in cotton. He didn't cry in the office, didn't ask panicked questions, just held Clara's hand as she nodded, already focused on the road ahead. And when they got back to the truck, it was she who broke the silence first, whispering, "It's going to be okay, you know." And Jeremy, staring straight ahead, replied, "Yeah, I can't lose you. Not now. Not ever." And she leaned over, kissed his shoulder and said, "Then don't lose me, walk beside me." And that's exactly what he did. Through every appointment, every infusion, every late night when she couldn't sleep because of the nausea or the ache in her bones, Jeremy stayed close, cooking soup from scratch even when it didn't stay down, setting up the guest room as a quiet space for her to rest, and leaning on the sanctuary team to take the lead, while he gave Clara his full attention. Nova, ever intuitive, barely left Clara's side, curling at her feet during treatment days, nudging her water glass closer when she hadn't sipped it in hours, and laying across her lap with a weight that grounded her when anxiety threatened to pull her apart. The sanctuary slowed a bit, but it never stopped. Curtis and Daryl stepped up, the staff adjusted schedules, and Clara, even in her fatigue, still answered emails and gave occasional interviews over the phone, her voice, softer now but still filled with that fierce clarity that made people listen. And as the weeks passed and the treatments continued, small victories began to emerge. Her numbers improved, the swelling in her lymph nodes reduced, and by fall, her doctor used the word remission for the first time, cautious but hopeful, and Jeremy felt his knees go weak hearing it, as if he'd been holding his breath for 3 months straight, and could finally exhale. They celebrated with ice cream and a sunset walk through the sanctuary, Clara leaning on his arm, Nova darting ahead and back again, and as they passed the bench under the shade tree, Jeremy paused, looked up at the sky streaked with orange and gold and whispered, "Thank you," not to any one person, but to the universe itself, to fate, to Max, to every invisible force that had carried them this far. In the quiet weeks that followed, Clara focused on rebuilding her strength, and Jeremy returned more fully to the sanctuary's daily rhythm, training, mentoring, listening, and one morning he received a letter from the same prison where he'd once awaited execution, written by a 22-year-old inmate named Alex, who had read about him in a magazine and asked if Jeremy would consider visiting and giving a talk. "Not to the officers," he wrote, "but to us, the ones inside, the ones still wondering if we'll ever breathe without bars again." Jeremy stared at the letter for a long time, torn. Returning to that place, even as a free man, was a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. But Clara, reading it over his shoulder, said gently, "You don't owe them anything. But maybe there's someone in there who needs to see what's possible." And so 2 weeks later, Jeremy walked through those prison gates again, not in chains this time, but in jeans and boots, Nova at his side in her vest, his head held high and heart thudding with old fear and new purpose. The visit was quiet. No cameras, no ceremony. Just a folding chair, a circle of inmates in worn uniforms, and Jeremy sitting down in the middle of them saying, "You don't know me, but you've walked where I've walked, and I'm here because I didn't stop walking." And for an hour he shared his story, not the headlines, but the heartbreak, the despair, the turning points. And when he finished, Alex stood up, eyes shining, and whispered, "You gave me something. I thought I'd lost hope." Jeremy drove home in silence, Nova asleep in the back seat. And when he pulled into the sanctuary and saw Clara standing on the porch, arms crossed and smiling like she always did when she was proud of him, he knew that visit had mattered more than most awards ever could. The rest of the year passed in a steady rhythm, healing, training, growing, and when Christmas came around again, Clara insisted on hosting a gathering for the entire Max's Circle network, inviting leaders from every affiliated sanctuary to visit Georgia for a 2-day retreat of connection, support, and shared purpose. They came from all over: Colorado, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Missouri, each with stories, questions, and updates. And for 2 days, the Georgia farm became more than a sanctuary. It became a symbol, a home, a heartbeat stretching across state lines. On the final night, as a bonfire crackled under the stars and dogs ran through the fields, Jeremy stood up beside the fire and spoke not with notes or a speech, but from the center of his chest. "We started this with one broken man and one dog who never gave up on him. And now look at us, we're not just surviving, we're changing the story, one dog, one soul, one truth at a time." And the applause that followed wasn't loud. It was deep, sustained, and full of the kind of respect that doesn't have to be shouted to be heard. Nova curled beside the fire. Clara leaned her head on Jeremy's shoulder, and above them, the sky stretched open and full of stars, not just distant points of light, but promises, thousands of them, shining quietly on a world they were still learning how to love. Spring the following year arrived not with a dramatic shift in temperature or some sweeping revelation, but through small, steady signs: the slow return of wildflowers along the fence line, the soft hum of bees weaving through the dogwood blossoms, and the way Clara's color returned little by little as her energy came back in waves instead of flickers. And Jeremy, watching her in those quiet, ordinary moments, felt something almost impossible to describe, something that lived somewhere between gratitude and reverence, because he had already known what it meant to lose everything, and now he was learning piece by piece what it meant to truly keep something, to hold it, nurture it, and let it grow beyond survival into something that could be called peace. Nova, now 5 years old and deeply woven into the rhythm of the sanctuary, took to the new season like a second wind, chasing birds along the field edges, napping on the porch steps in the afternoon light, and greeting every new dog with the calm authority of a creature who had seen the worst and still chosen to trust. The sanctuary itself had expanded again. A third barn converted into indoor training space for rainy days, a second set of cabins added for visiting trainers from the Max's Circle network, and the opening of a grief support wing inside the community center, where people who had lost pets or loved ones could come to sit, talk, or just listen, knowing that healing wasn't linear and didn't need to be explained to be valid. Clara oversaw much of the expansion, her strength returning slowly but surely, and Jeremy, now widely recognized not just as a survivor, but as a national advocate for criminal justice reform, had begun receiving invitations to speak not just at conferences and universities, but at legislative hearings across the country. And though he declined most of them, choosing to stay grounded in the work he loved, there was one invitation he couldn't ignore: a request from the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Criminal Justice to provide a testimonial during a proposed bipartisan review of wrongful conviction policy. The hearing would be broadcast nationally, a rare platform for a former inmate to speak directly to those with the power to rewrite law. And though the idea of walking into a chamber lined with suits and cameras made Jeremy's pulse thud with a deep, buried kind of fear, Clara encouraged him the same way she always had, not with pressure but with belief, telling him, "You've already lived through the hardest part. This is just the echo. Let them hear it." And so he went, suit jacket pressed, speech folded in his pocket, Nova walking confidently beside him through the marble corridors of Washington, a quiet symbol of resilience that drew curious glances and soft smiles from senators and staffers alike. When he finally sat before the microphone, facing the semicircle of lawmakers and the low hum of the national feed being broadcast live, Jeremy looked down at his notes, took a breath, then folded the paper and slid it aside, and spoke not from the page but from the marrow of his story. "I'm not here today to ask for sympathy. I'm here to ask for courage. Because the truth is, I died in that prison, not in body, but in the parts of me that believed the world was fair. And I came back to life not through some legal miracle, but through a dog who remembered me when the rest of the world forgot, through a woman who never stopped fighting, through strangers who showed up not because they had to, but because they chose to. If you want to know what justice looks like, it's not the gavel, it's what happens after the courtroom. It's the life someone still has to live after being told they don't deserve it. We can do better. We have to, because people are still dying in silence, and the only thing standing between them and the truth is whether we decide to listen. When he finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment longer than protocol normally allowed, and then questions came. Respectful, heartfelt, even from lawmakers he'd once assumed would see him as just another statistic. And by the end of the hearing, Jeremy had received standing applause from half the chamber and an invitation to consult on upcoming reform legislation, which he accepted only under one condition. If I do this, it's not in a suit and not from a podium. I do it from the sanctuary, from the dirt, from where this story actually lives. Back home, the response was overwhelming. Letters, donations, offers of partnership, but Jeremy remained focused, careful not to let the noise distract from the core of the mission. One dog, one trainer, one connection at a time. Nova continued to play her role as unofficial co-director, guiding nervous rescues, comforting grieving adopters, and keeping Jeremy on his feet, both literally and emotionally, especially when a late-season storm destroyed part of the agility. Yarden left several of the outer kennels damaged. He spent 3 straight days with a hammer and shovel in hand, rebuilding alongside the team, refusing to let the place that saved his life fall into disrepair, and by the weekend, everything was restored, stronger than before, with Clara surprising him by having a mural painted on the side of the new training barn. Max and Nova side by side, their eyes meeting the viewers, beneath the words, "Still here, still healing." Jeremy cried when he saw it, not the kind of sob that overtakes you, but the kind that begins slow, quiet, a release of something old and long held, and when Clara wrapped her arms around him, he whispered, "I don't know how we got so lucky," and she replied, "We didn't. We made lucky get out of our way." As summer neared, the sanctuary prepared for its 6th annual gathering of Max's Circle. More than 20 sanctuaries now, all run by people who'd once believed they were broken beyond repair, now teaching others how to rebuild. And this year, they added something new, a memorial walk, honoring the dogs who had passed and the people they had helped, a trail lined with wooden plaques bearing names and dates, each with a photo and a short note, and at the start of the trail, a large stone marked Max's name, along with the simple inscription, "The dog who waited, the dog who knew." The first walk was quiet, heavy with tears and soft laughter, volunteers and adopters moving slowly along the path as Nova led the way, and Jeremy followed last, his hand resting on Clara's back, the past and present walking side by side. And though the event was meant to be somber, it ended with music and dancing under the barn lights, a potluck of stories and shared memories, and Jeremy stood by the fire pit watching it all, kids tossing balls to dogs, former inmates telling jokes, Clara laughing with a woman from Minnesota who had named her sanctuary Promise Ridge after the vow she'd made to her late brother to help people like him one day. And Jeremy knew that whatever came next, whatever battles still waited down the road, this moment was real and it was enough. But just as the season began to settle into a familiar rhythm, another unexpected chapter started to unfold, one Jeremy hadn't planned for and hadn't even dared hope for until Clara brought home a folder from her latest doctor visit, handed it to him wordlessly, and waited while he opened it, read the first sentence, then looked up with wide, disbelieving eyes. She was pregnant. It had happened without trying, without planning, and after years of thinking they might never be parents, because of age, stress, health. Suddenly the impossible was happening, and Jeremy, for all his experience navigating chaos, felt his knees go weak. He lifted Clara off the ground in a hug that startled even Nova, then lowered her back down and just stood there, one hand on her belly and the other on her cheek, saying, "We're really going to do this." And Clara, eyes full, whispered, "We already are." The next months passed in a blur of appointments, adjustments, and preparation. A nursery built in what had once been the quiet office, where Max's old toys still sat on a shelf, a new wing under construction to ensure Clara had help during her recovery, and Nova adapting with her usual grace, curling up beside Clara during naps, following her protectively wherever she went, and sometimes resting her head on the growing bump as if she already understood what was coming. Jeremy balanced it all, the sanctuary, the network, the building projects, but always came home in time for Clara's cravings and evening walks, whispering stories to the baby growing inside her, like he was already preparing for a life built on truth and love and second chances. And when the night came, a stormy autumn evening, thunder in the distance, the air thick with change, Jeremy drove them to the hospital with hands steady but heart pounding like a drum, and 14 hours later, after pain and patience, and more tears than he'd ever admit, he held his son for the first time, a tiny, wrinkled bundle with his mother's mouth and his father's eyes, and when the nurse asked what name they'd chosen, Clara answered without hesitation, "Maxwell, Elias Knox, but we'll call him Eli." Jeremy looked down at the boy in his arms and knew with more certainty than anything he'd ever spoken into a courtroom that this child was not just a continuation of their story, he was a brand new beginning. The first thing Jeremy noticed about fatherhood wasn't how loud it was or how tired it made him, though both were undeniably true, but how quiet his heart had become in its presence, like something deep inside him had finally stopped running, stopped scanning the corners for danger, stopped bracing for the worst, and had instead settled into the kind of stillness he hadn't known since childhood, the kind of peace that made him tear up just watching his son breathe in his sleep, one tiny hand curled against his chest, and the other loosely gripping Nova's ear, as she lay protectively by the crib, her eyes half-lidded but always watching. They brought Eli home on a Monday morning under soft grey skies, the kind that threatened rain but never delivered, and as Clara carried him over the threshold of the farmhouse, Jeremy whispered a silent promise not to any god or higher power, but to the boy himself, that he would never let the shadows touch him, that he would protect this new life from everything that had ever tried to break his own. And though the first few weeks were full of the usual chaos, sleepless nights, endless feedings, the occasional moment where he just sat on the nursery floor with his head in his hands trying not to panic, it was also full of magic. The way Eli's fingers curled instinctively around Jeremy's thumb, the sound of Clara singing softly in the early morning when the whole world felt like it belonged only to them, and the indescribable feeling of being the one to calm his sons cry simply by holding him, skin to skin, heart to heart. The sanctuary staff kept everything running while they adjusted, dropping off meals and leaving little notes on the porch, with drawings from the youth trainees, stick figures of Jeremy holding a baby, Nova wearing a cape, Clara with a big, glowing sun over her head, and Jeremy hung each one on the fridge like sacred art. Reminders that their story had become part of so many others, woven into lives far beyond what he and Clara had ever expected. Nova, now solidly middle-aged but still sharp as ever, took to Eli like she'd been waiting for him all along, guarding his crib, alerting Clara when he stirred, even refusing her evening walks if the baby wasn't nearby. And Jeremy often joked that she was more mom than either of them, but deep down he knew it wasn't a joke at all. She was family, the last living link to the long road they'd survived, and he often found himself lying on the floor beside her, one hand on her back whispering, "You made all of this possible," and sometimes she'd let out a quiet sigh like she remembered too. As Eli grew, so did the sanctuary, slowly, organically, like a tree adding rings. Another training yard, a new partnership with a local VA hospital, a growing list of sanctuary interns who came from all corners of the country, hoping to learn not just about dogs, but about dignity, recovery, and what it really meant to hold space for someone who had been crushed by the world and still found the courage to stand up again. Max's Circle reached its 25th member sanctuary that spring, and Jeremy and Clara flew to Nebraska to cut the ribbon, bringing Eli with them and strapping him into a baby carrier as Jeremy addressed the crowd, his son's tiny fists resting against his chest as he told the story one more time, this time not from pain or memory, but from joy, a living, breathing symbol of what survival could look like when it had the chance to become something more. Reporters were there, of course, still following his journey, though Jeremy gave fewer interviews these days, not out of bitterness, but because the story didn't belong to headlines anymore. It belonged to the people living it, to the rescued, dogs learning to trust again, to the trainers rebuilding lives with their own hands, to the communities discovering that redemption wasn't some miracle, but a muscle you had to use every single day. And Jeremy wanted them to be the ones whose stories got told next. Back home, the sanctuary prepared for its 7th annual gathering, and this one was different, not because it was bigger or more attended, though it was, but because Jeremy had quietly decided it would be his last as director. Not a retirement, not a goodbye, but a transition, a handoff to a new generation of leaders, many of whom had come up through the program themselves, men and women Jeremy had trained with, cried with, and now trusted more than anyone else in the world to carry the mission forward. He told Clara first, one evening after Eli had fallen asleep and the crickets outside were just starting to sing, "I want to step back," he said softly, and Clara, holding his hand, simply nodded. It's time, because she'd known. It too had seen it in the way he lingered longer in the nursery, in the way his eyes wandered toward the hills during staff meetings, as if searching for the next chapter of his soul's story. They made the announcement quietly, not with fanfare but with a community bonfire, Jeremy standing in the field under the stars and explaining that stepping back didn't mean stepping away, that he would always be here, on the land, with the dogs, with the people. But that it was time for new voices, new leaders, new stories. The team took it with tears, but also with pride, because they had been trained well, not in obedience, but in compassion, consistency, and purpose, and the transition was seamless, a reflection of how solid the foundation had become. With more time at home, Jeremy focused on Eli, on writing, not a memoir this time, but children's books inspired by Max and Nova, stories about bravery, kindness, and trust. And when the first one was published, Clara read it aloud to a group of local school kids who came to visit the sanctuary, her voice steady, her smile soft as Jeremy watched from the back, holding Eli in his arms, feeling like life had become the very thing he used to only dream about through metal bars and bulletproof glass. But even in peace, time moves on, and one morning in late fall, Nova didn't get up. Not in a sudden, tragic way, but slowly, like a leaf letting go of its branch, her breathing labored, her eyes gentle but tired, and Jeremy knew the moment had come, the one he'd tried to prepare for but never could. They laid her in the back of the truck, Clara riding beside her, and drove to the vet wrapped in silence. The kind of silence that carries 1,000 words you can't bring yourself to say. And when the time came, Jeremy knelt beside Nova, pressed his forehead to hers and whispered, "You did it, girl. You brought me home." And as she took her last breath, a breeze passed through the open window, rustling the pages of the children's book Clara had left on the seat, the one Nova was featured in, and for a moment it felt like the whole world paused to bow its head. They buried her beside Max under the same shade tree, now surrounded by plaques and flowers from visitors all over the world, and Jeremy sat on the bench holding Eli in his lap, telling him stories about the dog who had waited and the one who had carried them the rest of the way. The sanctuary continued, the movement expanded, and Jeremy and Clara found a slower rhythm, planting a garden, hosting small writing workshops, watching Eli take his first steps between the porch and the training yard where the next generation of rescues learned to trust again. And every so often, Jeremy would walk alone out to the shade tree, sit between the two graves and just listen, not for voices or ghosts, but for the echo of love that never left, that still lived in the breeze, in the bark of a young dog, chasing its first ball, in the laughter of a once broken man now watching his son run free across a field that was once nothing but dirt and silence. And in those moments, he knew the truth he'd once fought so hard to believe, that his story wasn't about the day he almost died, but about every single breath he'd taken since, and how sometimes the greatest justice isn't found in courtrooms or laws, but in a child's laugh, a dog's trust, and the unshakable truth that love, when chosen again and again, can outlive anything, even the darkest of days.